This is Larry coming to you on another Sunday morning. I hope that you're having a good Sunday. And I am here literally surrounded by U-Haul trucks. I'm in the U-Haul parking lot. And the reason I'm here is because the story that we're going to start today, the story of Ruth, begins as a story about a big move. So I'm dividing this up into beginnings, endings, and our life in between. And so I want to read the beginning of the Book of Ruth, and then I'm going to skip to the end of the Book of Ruth, and then I want to talk about our lives in between. So let's turn to the beginning of the Book of Ruth. The beginning of the Book of Ruth starts this way. Now it came about in the days when judges governed that there was a famine in the land. And a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the land of Moab with his wife and his 2 sons. And the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. And the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites of Bethlehem in Judah. Now they entered the land of Moab and remained there. So I want to talk first of all about beginnings, because the story very, very clearly starts with a move. The first thing that happens in the story is this family moves. The thing that caught my eye about this story at the beginning is that this family is moving away from Bethlehem. It says Bethlehem in Judah. So what they're telling us here is that this family was in the center of God's country, and they moved away from God's country. And it says the place they went to was Moab. So you have Bethlehem, which is in Judah, which is in Israel, which is really the center of God's country. And they moved from there up into Moab, which is not a part of God's country. So in the context of the Old Testament, I don't want to read too much into it, but in the context of the Old Testament, you have a family that's born into God's country, and they move out of it. I don't want to read too much into that. We'll talk about that next week a little bit more. But it's also hits me as very interesting that the reason they move is not at all a bad reason. They move because there's a famine and there's no food. So the story starts with a family making a big move, and in the context, they're making a move away from the place where they started, and also making a move away from God's country. Now, let's remember that. That's the beginning. We're leaving out a whole bunch. Let's skip to the ending. The ending of the story in chapter 4, then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and became his nurse. And the neighbor women gave him, this child, a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." So they named him Obed. And then this is the key line. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David. So we jump from the beginning to the end of the story. At the end of the story, we see that whatever has happened in the middle, this family that moved away from God's place, now Naomi finds herself back in the center of God's place, but even more significantly than the geography is what God has done to fulfill this woman's dreams way beyond whatever she possibly could have thought was going to happen in her life. Because we see her here that her friends say to her that she's had a son. And basically what they're saying is that she has had a grandson. And she takes this grandson. She's surrounded by women who are praising God because of what's happened to her. And she gets to take this grandchild on her lap. And I haven't done that yet. I hope to take a grandchild on my lap sometime. I haven't done it yet. Some of you have done that. But I can imagine that this is a great moment of joy in life for Naomi to have a little baby on her lap, kind of seeing the future when she looks at this little kid. And also being surrounded by people in the community who are joyful because of what's happened in her life. So she's blessed in the short term of her life. But there's a double blessing, because she's not just blessed in the short term, she's actually doubly blessed in the long term because of this last line, which is a significant one, that says, Obed is the father of Jesse, and Jesse is the father of David. The significance of this is that David is the great king of all the Old Testament. David is the one who, more than any other character in the Old Testament, is symbolic and typifies the coming of Jesus Christ, God's Son, God himself coming to earth. So do you see what's happening? You see what's happened in this story? This family that left God's place because there was a famine, now the mother ends up back in the center of God's country, but also in the center of God's will, and she gets to be a part of the great story of the whole Old Testament salvation that God is bringing to her people. So God has expanded her hopes in circles and circles and circles and circles, making a bigger and bigger and bigger blessing. So we looked at the beginning, we've looked at the ending, and now let's look at our lives in between. The reason this stuck out to me, and I think it's significant, is because in our lives, we make a lot of moves. Some of them we don't think about again. We make the move and it's over and we don't think about it. But there's other moves in our life that we make, and we spend a lot of time analyzing and replaying that move in our life. Some people in their marriages, they look back and they question a marriage and they say, why did I do that? Should I have done that? Have I ruined my life? Some people look at moves that they've done from one state to another, or you look at moves career-wise, that you took a job or you left a job, and we can spend a lot of time rehashing that in our mind and saying, should I have made that move or not? And it can really become oppressive because we analyze and analyze and analyze, and it becomes a form of self-oppression, self-condemnation, and it takes our life and it puts our life in a downward trajectory. And especially when you're in difficult times, in good times, nobody really questions their decisions, they just are happy. But in difficult times, it's very easy to start looking back at moves in our life and think that we made the wrong move. Now, this is what the context that I want to put our lives in the context of the beginning and the ending of this book of Ruth. This is the really important part. it's important for us, as we read this story, to see all of our lives, all of the big moves, the macro moves and the micro moves, all the decisions we've made. Super important for us to put it in the context of God's bigger move. That's what the Book of Ruth is opening up to tell us. Whatever moves you've made, whatever decisions you've made, by faith, take that and put it in the context of what God has done. I'll finish with this. At the end of the story, Naomi doesn't realize it, but we realize it, that she is part of the great story of God's redemption. So we have to circle that and realize that God is telling us through this that we too, yes, believe it or not, we are in the picture of God's great redemption. Because David leads to Jesus, and Jesus is the great Redeemer. Now, our lives are in the center of that circle. Our lives, our story, is all of our moves are in the context and the big picture of God's great salvation. So I want to add one thing that hopefully will be helpful to you, because it's been in my mind quite a bit. At the beginning of this story, when they leave God's country, but they leave because there's a famine, I see a tension between those two things. On the one hand, it seems like they're doing something they should never do in the Bible, which is leave God's country. On the other hand, they're leaving to find food, and you can't fault any family for moving so that they can eat. So what I see in that is this is a mixed move. This is not a story of here's people doing the wrong thing or here's people doing the absolutely right thing. It's not a moralistic story of look what happens when you do the perfect thing, or look what bad things happen to you when you do the wrong thing. That's not the way the story opens. I think it's significant because the reality is we have made moves in our life that are not either all good or either all bad. We live in the in-between. We do things for practical reasons. We do things for all sorts of mixed reasons. So to put it in context, you make a move somewhere to take a job. And in doing that, you're looking for the 100% God side of things, or you're looking for the whole thing to collapse. But a lot of times that doesn't happen. You have to make a decision and you make that move. And if we are living in a frame of mind, if we're living in a frame of mind where we're either wanted to be perfect or God to completely close everything off, we're going to grind ourselves painfully our whole lives, instead of taking it in stride and saying, I don't know if I made the right move or not, but I know how big God is. So I made a move to take a job. I don't know if it was perfect or not. I couldn't prove that I'm in 100% the right place. Or if you move away or you make a decision, you don't know if you've 100% made the right decision. But that's not what God is asking us to do. And this is where the story of Ruth starts pouring grace into our lives. Because wherever you live, whatever job you have, whatever your family looks like, we can take a deep breath and realize that God's grace is pouring into our lives. And it's okay that we are where we are, because we're not outside of God's sovereignty. We are not outside of God's love. We are not outside of God's great plan. He is going to bring grace to bear on our situation. Can you receive that this morning as you listen to this movie, wherever you are? Allow God to say to you that it's okay. He has good plans for your specific situation, even though you got into it imperfectly. Sometimes we define moves in our life in a very negative way. We make them a permanent negative part of our story. So when you're talking to, you'll be talking to someone and they'll say, you visit them at their house and they'll say, we never should have bought this house. We never should have bought this house. A lot of times it'll be a husband and a wife sitting there together, and you can tell that one of them wanted to buy the house and the other one didn't want to buy the house. And one of them will say in conversation, we never should have bought this house. I knew at the time God didn't want us to buy the house, but I went along with it. So you realize what's happening in that situation is here you have a family that's living in a house where at least one member of the family feels like they're living in a house that is against what God wanted, which then brings conflict into the home, because you have people not living gratefully and happily together, thinking that they're living the life that God wants them. They have actually defined their life in a negative way and written their story and written condemnation into the move that they made to buy that house. I think we do this with all kinds of things. We say, should I have done that? Or worse, what I'm saying is we'll say, I know I shouldn't have done that. What I like about the story of Ruth is it's not doing that. It's not taking the approach that says, look at this family that moved away from God's country. They never should have done that. Instead, it says, look at this mixed move that this family made. But look at it in the context of the ending that God brought about. God's grace is greater than all of the wranglings and the mental gymnastics and the should we or shouldn't we's. In the end, God is big enough to cover it all with his grace and his loving kindness. So if you find yourself defining a decision or a move in your life negatively time and time again, I'd like to ask you to reconsider that and put it in the context of this prophetic story, which tells the story of God's grace for us in our lives now.